Well, good morning, Jef. Welcome at the studios of Ghent University. We're here for an interview or a long chat for the section Voices in Pragmatics of the IPRA website. So as you know, Voices in Pragmatics wants to give the floor to people who have contributed significantly, as the website says it, to the field of pragmatics. Well, as founder of IPRA, of the journal Pragmatics, as author and scholar of very important publications in the field of pragmatics, organizer of the IPRA conferences, I think the adverb significantly is a gross understatement. So it's really an honor and a pleasure to have you here for this chat.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here, and especially getting such a flattering introduction is always nice.
Yes, yeah, well, you deserve it. Well, I would like to start somewhere, maybe against the rules of logic, somewhere in the middle of the history of the field of pragmatics. Could you tell us a bit more about your entrance into the field? When and how and with what academic background you made your first steps into the field? And maybe also at what stage the discipline had reached at that moment, if it was already a discipline since its inception.
Yeah, that's a very broad question, of course, and I will have to go back all the way to my first years at the university, which was the very early 1970s. And actually, I entered university as the first one in my family to go to university. I was very lucky because I was also the youngest of the family, which made it more affordable for my parents to let me go to university. And I had gone to a high school because priests in my village thought they could make a priest out of me. So they took me to their high school, so I got a good high school education. And then when it came to choosing a field for study, I took something very traditional, which in those days was called Germanic philology, which was the study of Germanic languages and literatures. And the idea at that time was to get an education to become a teacher. Right, so that was the main orientation of me and my fellow students in those days. Now, I didn't know anything about linguistics. I knew about studying languages.
Latin.
I had my Latin and Greek and a little bit of English and a little bit of German in high school. But in high school, actually, and this is very important, I got a very good history teacher and a very good teacher of Dutch. So, and it's especially the teacher of Dutch who was probably influential in my choice. But of course, in high school, we didn't learn about linguistics. No, you could learn languages, but linguistics was a discipline we hadn't even heard of. So in the first years of university, you start to get introduced into literary studies and also into linguistics. And in those days, the rising field in linguistics was generative grammar. So I dived into the library, and my first reading of linguistics was Chomsky's Aspects of a Theory of Syntax. And actually, I found it very interesting reading, especially the beginning chapters, where there is a lot of talk about cognition, about competence, linguistic competence. I must say that towards the end of the book, I was losing interest in all the technicalities, mainly because I really didn't manage to link up with the idea that it was so simple to be able to think about a deep structure that then would have to get transformed to all kinds of surface structures and things like that. It didn't appeal to me. But it was my first confrontation with linguistics.
Okay.
And in those days also, there was an assistant professor, Frans Daams, who brought in guest speakers. And one of those guest speakers was Pieter Seuren, who in those days was teaching in Cambridge, I think. And he came over for a guest lecture and was giving a very enthusiastic talk about his views of linguistics. And so there was something that was kindling interest in the field. But then the main influence on my orientation was no doubt another professor, namely Louis Goossens, whom you well know.
Professor of English.
So he was a professor of English, and he actually was choosing textbooks for us that were very new at that time. Like, for instance, in his course on history of English, he was using Elizabeth Trogot's book, which is called, I think, if I remember correctly, The History of English Syntax, or something like that. Anyway, it was about the history of English syntax, and it was also written from a transformational generative perspective, though that was not the main tone. The main tone in the book actually was functionality. So the book actually even didn't start out in the way in which history books normally start, way back, with Old English or something. No, it started out with a chapter on present-day English and mostly functional aspects of syntax. Okay. And then from there, she went back to earlier periods in the history of English, which where then the main question was now, why did this development take place? And how can we talk about this in terms of functionality? So that was one book that was very influential for me in my orientation towards linguistics. Another one was Wallace Chafe. So with a book that had only just been published, which had as a title "Meaning in the Structure of Language." And also that book is one that is very, very much based on ideas of functionality and discourse functions and
use,
so on, and language use. And so, well, we got reading that was pushing us in a very specific direction. And then when it came to choosing a topic for a thesis, then Louis Goossens recommended that I should read John Searle's Speech Act theory, Speech Acts. Okay, so I was immediately, in those years of my university training, immediately put into the bath of looking at language from the point of view of language use.
Exactly. We're talking about first half of the 70s, right?
That was between 72 and 74.
Yep.
Yeah. So I was immediately introduced in there. And then in those days also, well, what was part of the readings that we got were also texts by the generative semanticists, like George Lakoff. So we read work by him. We got to read work by Charles Fillmore. We got to read also Michael Halliday's book on functions of language. And we got to see a mimeographed version of Delheim's communicative competence. So before it had appeared, we got this mimeographed version as a counterbalance to the idea of linguistic competence on a Chomskyan basis. So actually, in those days, in those years, I was more thinking about what I was interested in as some sort of functional semantics.
Okay.
But the term pragmatics was already there. Like for instance, you must remember that. Well, it was a term that was being applied to a whole bunch of very divergent kinds of things, which is why Bar Hillel, for instance, wrote his famous paper on out of the pragmatic wastebasket.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but the field had already really started to become crystallized. It had become crystallized to such an extent that, for instance, in '75 already, so which was just after I finished my studies, but I was still in Antwerp, still at the university at that time. '75 was the period in which Steve Levinson and Gerald Gazdar launched what they called pragmatics microfiche, which was actually the first pragmatics journal, but it was in the form of microfiche.
Okay.
So and actually it was the content of that was just as broad as the field of pragmatics is today. Like for instance, I remember talking to Rod Watson, who is now 80 years old, a British sociologist, who is still grateful to Steve Levinson and Gerald Gazdar for publishing some of his work as a sociologist, right? So he couldn't get his work published in any sociology journals because it was too much about language.
Yeah, and vice versa.
so it was being taken up by these youngsters, Steve Levinson and Gerald Gazdar, who were very, very open-minded. So Gazdar, who himself actually was much more oriented towards formal pragmatics, but still that didn't stop him from allowing in all kinds of other kinds of perspectives. So in '75, when you see the appearance of a microfiche journal that is called Pragmatics Microfiche, well, it's clear that the field has already crystallized enough to be part of the name of a journal.
Yeah.
Only 2 years later, in '77, the Journal of Pragmatics started. Which is actually around the same time that I think they stopped the Pragmatics Microfiche because there was the real journal competitor. So the field was there. Also, it was sufficiently there to also make me get interested in compiling a bibliography of pragmatics.
Okay, at that point.
Because the first effort in that direction was published actually in 1978 already. So which was called an annotated bibliography of pragmatics, a 250-page bibliography of pragmatics, which was already there 5 years actually before the first real pragmatics textbooks appeared. Which were the 1983 books by Jeffrey Leach, Principles of Pragmatics, and then Levinson Pragmatics. But Levinson's Pragmatics, of course, was the culmination point of many years of teaching pragmatics, because he had been teaching a pragmatics course in Cambridge in those years preceding. So. So pragmatics was simply in the air. So it was there. So it was not at all accidental that this, especially not because of the way in which my own university education was being oriented. It was not surprising that that was the field that attracted my attention and that I got stuck in for the rest of my life.
And that led you to choice for a PhD, or am I?
Well, yes, I've been extremely lucky. In many ways. So that already started with the possibility of going to the university, which was not obvious with my background at all. And then, okay, if you get good results at university, you always find people who support you. And then there was Joris Duitschaver, whom you also remember, whose field was literary studies. Mainly James Joyce. and he was actually very active in trying to find channels for students of the University of Antwerp to go and study abroad. And he was actually the one who showed us the possibility of applying for a Harkness Fellowship, right? Which is, which unfortunately for students from continental Europe does not exist anymore. So I think it still exists for people from the UK and from other Commonwealth countries. But in those days, also continental European students could apply for Harkness Fellowships, and actually there were 2 of those fellowships given per continental European country, or what was at that time the European community, right? 2 students per country could be selected. I was applying for that. Another colleague who was applying for it was Johan van der Auwera. And actually in 75, we both got such a fellowship. And so the main thing was we had to look for a place to go to. And a relatively obvious choice in those days was, if you were interested in looking at language from a language use point of view, an obvious choice was University of California, Berkeley. So where you had the 2 Lakoffs, so George Lakoff, Robin Lakoff, Charles Fillmore, Wallace Jef was also teaching there in those days. So, and not only were they there in the linguistics department, in other departments at UC Berkeley, there were all the other people who were interested in the same field. Like in anthropology, there was John Gumpertz, and in philosophy, there was John Searle, actually also Paul Grice. But Paul Grice had just retired, so he, so I still saw him running around, but I never took any of his courses. But John Searle was there. Then in the psychology department, there was Susan Irvin Tripp, there was Dan Slobin.
All at Berkeley.
All at Berkeley. also in the anthropology department, there were also Berlin and Kay with their color term studies and so on. So you got a grouping of people that could only be stimulating.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, that's a dream team.
Yes, it was a dream team. And also in those days, they went to each other's graduate classes.
They did.
So there was a permanent atmosphere of discussion, exchange, and there must have been underneath a lot of competition as well. But that's inevitable. But that didn't come to the surface in those interactions. This was really a very, very vibrant atmosphere. So once we got there, I thought, well, okay, to benefit maximally from this situation, I will have to enroll in a PhD program. And then, fortunately, the people there were all extremely helpful. And so I managed to get into a PhD program, and that's how my further career was actually shaped.
And who was your supervisor then for that PhD?
My supervisor was Charles Fillmore.
Yeah.
And the other members of the dissertation committee later were John Searle and George Lakoff.
Wow. Yeah. And can you tell us a bit about the PhD, the topic that you chose, or that? So I was very generally interested in this field of pragmatics, the study of language use, because already in those days I only looked at it as, okay, if you want to define pragmatics, it's simply the science of language use, which necessarily makes it an interdisciplinary kind of thing. So, but I had been especially interested in
also in courses on, by Charles Fillmore, for instance, on lexical semantics. And if you say lexical semantics, you think, well, okay, this could be something very far removed from pragmatics, but not in the views of Charles Fillmore. Because for him, in those days, he was developing all those ideas about frame semantics. And you couldn't talk about the meaning of words without them being fit into some sort of interactional frame.
Okay.
Now, and
Excuse me to interrupt. Did they use the term pragmatics at that time? At Berkeley, was it used?
it was used, but it was not. But it was not the term that was being used to
That rallied them together.
No, it was not the term that rallied them together. No, actually, what rallied them together was much more cognitive science.
Okay.
Because also in those days there were huge cognitive science grants that were being distributed across universities in the United States, and what got them together was really the idea that humanities and social sciences, that they are all inevitably dealing with things that happen in the human mind. And so cognitive science was actually the glue between all their interests, and somehow people like Fillmore and the Lakoffs and Searle and people in the psychology department, they were all part of a cognitive science program, basically.
That's surprising, because one would think language in use, pragmatics, that, well, first and foremost, it would be viewed as a social thing, right? An interactive, social, cultural specific, and so on.
Yeah, but the point is, of course, that if you talk about language use, and if you talk about the social structures that come in, and if you talk about the cultural patterns that come in, they are all mediated somehow through the mind.
Through mind,
So, and that is something that everybody in those days understood very clearly. That's why also an anthropologist like John Gumpertz was also associated with this. So there was no separation there between the social and the cognitive.
I see.
So, and I think that is, until today, that is still essential to realize this, that there is no way to talk sensibly about society without taking cognition taking that into account.
And vice versa.
And vice versa. There is no way of talking sensibly about cognition without keeping in mind that there are also things that happen in society.
Well,
so, so that was the glue. It had the label cognitive science, but it was not restricted to what, in a narrow view, you would define as cognitive.
No.
Right.
The mind in society and society in the mind. That's early. You have to, as an insight. I mean, that's something we still often have to struggle for.
Yeah, you still have to struggle for it. Yes.
Yeah.
But it was already there. Yeah.
Okay.
But where were we?
With your PhD.
Okay.
Choice of topic.
Yes. Now, okay. So in those days, I also got very good American friends, of course, and one of them was also a sociologist, Tim McDaniel. Now, and he actually has been extremely instrumental in the development of my ideas, simply by handing me one little book, which was Peter Winch, The Idea of a Social Science and Its Relation to Philosophy. That's the book, a 1950s book, so from a British philosopher. And actually, just to summarize the gist of the book in one sentence, it all comes down to this, namely, there is no way in which you can talk about social action without trying to understand the way in which the social action is being interpreted by the people involved in it. Right? So, and the standard example that they give then is, of course, okay, yes, if you want to understand the caste system in India, As a sociologist, you could travel to India with your suitcase full of sociological concepts, such as class and mobility, and you could come back and say, "Oh, I found it. Caste is class without mobility." But that would not give you a good understanding of what happens there, right? Now, why was this so important for me? Well, because I thought, well, most probably, if we want to get a good understanding of what happens in language use, we cannot avoid taking into account the way in which language use is being talked about.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was the whole starting point for my dissertation. Namely, okay, let's start to look systematically at lexical items, and of course that's only one aspect of the way in which language is talked about, but it's one aspect. So let's look systematically at lexical items that are being used in different languages to talk about language. And for me, that was also the way of getting into a field that later then I would call metapragmatics. Because it is somehow a meta level of studying language use.
Sure.
Metapragmatics, which actually was a term that more or less simultaneously in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, was also being developed by Michael Silverstein in Chicago from a much more general point of view. So he was talking about much more than lexical items. So that was, for him, that was only one technical aspect. But my thesis was all about this, and since in those days, I was also under pressure to finish the program as fast as possible, because the most interesting way to go forward with this idea would have been, of course, to start doing some field work in contexts that you're less familiar with and so on. But I was under pressure to finish a program because my time was limited and resources were limited. So I decided to just make use of my competence of English and Dutch and start making systematic comparisons in specific lexical subfields of the field of speech act terminology that I could sensibly compare. That was simply what the thesis was all about. That's all.
And so when did you submit your PhD? Did you get the?
I finished the PhD in '79. The degree was awarded in 1980, I think. And then later, actually a slightly revised version of the dissertation got also published as a book, and that was '85. So much later. So it took much more time to get.
In those days, books took more time.
It took much more time.
And then you came back to Belgium.
Then there are different periods there. So I first came back to Belgium in '78, so actually before finishing the dissertation. But in that period, pragmatics had really caught on. The Journal of Pragmatics had started appearing. And then there was another Belgian colleague, Herman Parret, so philosopher, who, philosophy of language, who was also very interested in the field of pragmatics. And so he decided to ask both me and Marina Sbissa, Italian philosopher, who actually did the final re-edition of How to Do Things with Words, John Austin's book. And so he asked Marina Sbissa and me to co-organize a conference in Urbino, which took place in '79. And that was a relatively small conference, maybe 250 people, something like that. But people who were there were, well, someone who had promised to be there but didn't show up was Paul Grice.
Oh.
But,
Yeah.
but people who were there were people like Susan Irvin Tripp, Steve Levinson was there, Max Atkinson and John Heritage were there. So you could see it was already quite a mixed bunch.
Yeah.
So, because also the influence from conversation analysis was coming in. So we had that conference in '79. Then in '81, after 3 years back in Belgium, I went to Berkeley again for 2 years. And actually, that was a very interesting period for me as well, because as I said, while I was a PhD student in the first 3 years that I was in Berkeley, I was in a hurry, so I had to finish all the requirements as fast as possible, which meant that I didn't have time in those days to look around enough in other departments. And it is only in the period '81, '83 that I seriously got in touch with, for instance, John Gumpertz. So, so I had not really been in touch with him in that first period.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit surprising, maybe, because one of John Gumpertz's students who became totally central for the field of pragmatics was Steve Levinson. So he was a student of John Gumpertz. And also other fellow students in those days, there were many of them who were working across the departmental boundaries. Like, for instance, I think that Deborah Tannen was there as a student in those days as well. I think her supervisor was also John Gumpertz.
Look at that.
So also supervision of dissertations went really across department boundaries all the time.
Yeah.
Now, okay, and in those years, '81 to '83, when I was back in Berkeley, I was also co-teaching a course with Fillmore and Searle and Gumpertz on metapragmatics. So, and it's in that period actually that I finalized the manuscript for what appeared as a book. So, and then '83, back in Belgium. Actually, one thing I should not forget, in the run-up towards that second stay in Berkeley, I visited Berkeley briefly for one of the Berkeley Linguistic Society meetings, which is also the time when Chuck Fillmore then came up with the idea of co-teaching a course when I would be coming back. Well, in that visit just before that, I met someone who has been very essential for the rest of my academic career, and that is Jan-Ola Östman. So he was in that period that when I was not in Berkeley, he was in Berkeley as a PhD student.
Okay.
So he was also a student of Chuck Fillmore's. And actually, the first conversation we had actually was in a place on Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley, which was called the Belgian Waffle House.
Whoa, look at that! Yeah,
which is no longer there.
Oh, that's a pity. Yeah.
But so we, and it was pretty clear that we could talk very fruitfully on an equal basis, and that ideas were going in the same direction, which is also why then later on, the main work that I've been doing together with Jan-Ola is what later became this Handbook of Pragmatics, so which was the first one of its kind. There are many more now,
but sure.
But it was
we'll
the
come to
first
that.
kind. So I should not forget that episode, which has been extremely crucial. Then another important event was after I came back to Belgium in '83. was I think it was still in 83 or maybe it may have been early 84 that Johan van der Auwera, so a colleague from Antwerp, together with Svenka Savic from then Yugoslavia, organized a seminar on semantics and pragmatics in Dubrovnik. And that was also a very small scale seminar, but an extremely stimulating one, which then basically triggered the idea of organizing an international pragmatics conference the year later in 85.
In 85.
In Viareggio.
The first one carrying that name, pragmatics.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
85.
Yes.
Yeah, so the 1980s have been quite important, I think, also in crystallizing and catalyzing what had been done before. There's the two landmark publications by Leach and Levinson, and your own publication.
Yes.
And then the organization of that first, well, it wasn't called an IPRA conference, it was called a Pragmatics Conference.
International Pragmatics Conference, indeed.
Yeah, but
and it is only then that the idea came up to get an association off the ground.
Exactly.
Because, well, okay, and here I have to use my
Go ahead.
My notes here.
Yeah.
I just copied the the contents of the proceedings of the Viareggio conference, and well, just to show who was all there. Herbert Clark was there, Yves Clark was there, Marcelo Dascal from Israel, Susan Irvin Tripp, Steve Levinson, Jan Ole Oostman, of course, Bruce Fraser was there, Del Heims was there, János Petőfi, so a name we haven't mentioned yet, but is pretty important in the field of text linguistics and things like that. Paul Hopper was there, David Holcroft, Robert van Velen, who actually was also a fellow student of mine in the first years in Berkeley. Robert Harnish, Stephen Davis, Umberto Eco was there as well.
Look at that, yeah.
So these are just a few, but it was an event that clearly attracted enough divergent attention to think of the idea of setting up an international pragmatics association. And so the next step then was to to ask people whether that was a good idea.
It was would be viable.
Whether it would be viable. And so what you do then is you write to a bunch of people whom you think would be interested. It turned out that, and then of course you also offer them something. You say, well, okay, are you interested, and are you possibly interested in being a member of a consultation board for this association if it is set up? We ended up with a consultation board of 90 people.
Whoa, yeah.
So and you just name them and they are there. So it's everybody who had anything significant to say in the field was actually there.
Member of the board.
So clearly there was something in the air. So it worked, and that's how it took off.
So first the conference, Viareggio. From there, the idea to found an association.
That's right.
And then there was the journal Pragmatics. Right? Is that in the same time?
Well, actually, the first things that IPRA as an association published were things such as a number of working documents. Some of them were also working documents, which was still something else. Which already contained some things that were in preparation of what would later become the Handbook of Pragmatics. Now, what was I going to say?
Publications by the association.
Oh yeah, publications of the association, right? Yeah, yes, the first journal-like publication that emerged from the association was what was called IPRA Papers in Pragmatics.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that was actually an initiative by Alessandro Duranti, anthropologist from UCLA, and Bambi Scheffelin, also an anthropologist, American anthropologist from New York University. So they were the first editors of this IPRA, Papers in Pragmatics. Then, after a number of years, and now I forget precisely what the year was, but it must have been around 1990, it was decided that, okay, the IPRA Papers in Pragmatics, which were 2 issues per year, well, okay, we might want to go to 4 issues per year, give it more the label of a real journal rather than IPRA Papers in Pragmatics.
Professionalization.
Just some professionalization. And in the first year, Bambi Scheffelin and Alessandro Duranti were still the editors. But then it became a little too much for them. And they decided that they would, well, it was not only because it was becoming too much for them, I think, but also because in those days also the ideas were arising for a journal of linguistic anthropology, which the subsection of the American Anthropological Association, which was dealing with linguistic anthropology, was then setting up. So attention of anthropologists was moving not away from pragmatics, but okay, they had to divide their attention more. And it's then that, but then of course it was another anthropologist, Günter Senft, who took over, who first took over editorship together with a few others, then later became editor-in-chief when the team expanded for the journal that is now called Pragmatics.
The linguistic anthropologists never left pragmatics, right? So it wasn't a matter of competition.
No, it was not a matter of competition. No, it was just a broadening of the channels of publication.
Absolutely.
Because, well, also our first president, the first president of the association was John Gumpertz.
John Gumpertz, anthropologist. No, it's clear already from what you've just said that IPRA has not been, has been instrumental, even instrumental is not strong enough, has been defining and shaping pragmatics from the 1980s onwards, the field of pragmatics to become the discipline as we know it today. So you've mentioned the journal, the conferences. Maybe we can talk a bit more about the conferences. So the first conference was in Viareggio. There's also the handbook of pragmatics, the bibliography of pragmatics. Maybe you can say a bit more about those things, the conferences, the handbook.
Yeah, so, bibliography. Well, the bibliography, actually as I said, the first one appeared in '78. Well, it was not even the first one because before that there was a smaller one concentrating completely on speech act theory, which was published by Indiana University Linguistics Club, which was a quite important, very active group that was publishing those photocopied working paper like things, and so they also published a first bibliography of speech act theory. And then actually it was when I was briefly back in Europe in the summer of '77 when I went to Congress of Linguists in Vienna in those days, that I met Jacob Meij, who shortly after that also asked me to get involved in the Journal of Pragmatics as a review editor. So there was Jacob Meij and Hartmut Haberland and Ferenc Kiefer, who also plays a very important role in all of this, because he later also became one of the presidents of IPRA. So we, so in those, well, at that conference in Vienna, I also met one of the editors of one of the series was already being published by John Benjamins in those days, a series of bibliographies, and he asked me whether it wouldn't be a good idea to have a bibliography of pragmatics, a real one, and that's okay. So so you need a lot of people to get things going. And so this was not, well, I did it by myself, but I wouldn't have done it without that extra stimulus. Yeah. And so in 1987, there was that first bibliography. And then immediately afterwards, and this already emerged in the talk with Jacob Meij and the other editors of the Journal of Pragmatics in those days, in the 70s. So the idea was that as soon as the bibliography of pragmatics would have appeared, annual supplements would appear in the Journal of Pragmatics. And that is what also happened since then until 1987, which is when we then got this 4-volume bibliography that I co-compiled with Jan Naerts. So in 1987, that was 4 volumes of bibliography. And after that, I don't remember actually, I should have looked it up, but I don't remember actually whether there were any further supplements in Journal of Pragmatics. A while later, that whole database was then converted to an online database by John Benjamin's publishing company. And it is in that form that it still exists today. Yeah. But that's only an instrument.
Yeah, of course.
Right?
Yeah, well.
But at a certain time, it was a useful instrument. We need more discussion about, I think, about how to keep going forward with this. But it certainly served its purpose for quite a long time.
As has the handbook.
And the handbook, which was then first published in 1995, I think. So the first book publication was what we call the manual, which was actually a collection of articles about all kinds of disciplines and traditions contributing to the field of pragmatics in this very broad sense in which we were already handling it. And then ever since then, there were annually additions to that. And that keeps going.
It keeps going. As do the IPRA conferences.
As do the IPRA conferences.
Can you walk us a bit through the history of the conference?
Well, as we already said, the first one was basically via Reggio, but in those days we still thought, okay, let's do something that does not create a kind of pattern that you are then forced into following.
Okay.
which is why we called it International Pragmatics Conference and not something like First International Pragmatics Conference. We didn't know whether there would have to be a follow-up at all. And we basically kept that idea even after setting up the International Pragmatics Association. We didn't give the conferences any numbers.
Okay.
So there was one following the one in Antwerp in 1987.
Yeah.
The following one was 3 years later in Barcelona. And then there was a proposal from Kobe 3 years later in 1993. But for the purposes of the Japanese, for them to get the necessary subsidies, for them it was important to show that this was part of a tradition.
Okay, so they started.
And so they thought we need to give this a number.
Serial number.
And then the question was, where do we start?
Which one was the first one?
Do we start with the setting up of the association, which would have made the 87 conference the first? Or do we start before that with Reggio? Now, in negotiation with the Japanese organizers, Paul Takahara and Matt Shibatani. So in consultation with them, we decided that for them it would be better to have the number 4 than the number 3.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So that's why we started in Viareggio.
As the first one. Yeah.
Okay, and so we then had the conference in Kobe, which well, all conferences until then, it had only been growing or at least attracting more or less equal numbers of people and very diverse groups of people. Exactly the kind of audience that we wanted, because the whole idea was to simply create a forum that would allow people from very different disciplines, but all interested in aspects of language use, that would allow them to be able to meet and talk to each other. So that was the whole idea. Because if you think about a field that you would call the science of language use, that is simply too broad to be looked at from only one perspective.
Yeah.
So you need by definition very many different perspectives. And so what you are dealing with is something that necessarily is a fragmented field. But there is nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with the fragmentation. As long as it is possible to keep talking across the fragments.
Yeah,
and that has always been the idea behind the International Pragmatics Association. And the conferences that were following the first ones have shown that this did work.
It works. Yeah.
That it worked.
It works, yeah.
So there are fluctuations there. Like, for instance, our current president, Marinas Bissa, will say that she thinks it's a pity that there is actually not much philosophy left in what we find at the conferences. Even though the origins of the field of pragmatics, you cannot think about them without talking about philosophy of language. You cannot talk about it without talking about Austin and Grayson and Searle. So she has been pointing this out for a number of years, so that actually, philosophy, somehow it has to be revived within that context. In the same way, there was the complaint by Susan Irvin Tripp that actually the interest in developmental pragmatics seemed to be declining within the context of the International Pragmatics Association.
So you do forever, right?
So you do get fluctuations there, and there is no reason why, if something gets backgrounded, it cannot be foregrounded again.
Absolutely.
So anyway, the context is there where that is possible. After Kobe, then we got to Mexico City. That was again 3 years later. So in that period, it was every 3 years. Then after Mexico City, we jumped to 2 years. So in 98, there was the conference in Reims, in France. The next one was in Budapest 2 years later again, 2000. Then again we had a period of 3 years after that, mainly because we hadn't, when we were getting together in Budapest, so we hadn't yet received any viable proposal for a site for the next conference. Which is why we then decided, well, rather than to rush into something, let's just take an extra year. And that's why there was this gap of 3 years again. So it's always been a very flexible kind of thing. Then, unfortunately, in Toronto, SARS hit, which cut participation in half, and which made it rather difficult to survive as an association after that, because basic costs remain the same. So, but the income gets eroded. So that was a very difficult period. But ever since then, well, first there was Riva del Garda, then Gothenburg, then Melbourne, Manchester, and so on. So you can just read up on the history
Sure.
on the website.
Yeah.
So ever since Toronto, it's been every second year. Next one is going to be in Australia, Brisbane.
Melbourne, Brisbane. Yeah.
And with those conferences, you have to go along with the challenges that are there. So there are always different ones. So Mexico City was relatively chaotic because of the distance between hotels and the campus where the meetings were taking place. Then the campus itself was a huge campus, the UNAM campus. So it's incredibly huge. It's a campus for, I think, 200,000 students or something like that. So buildings were a little bit too far apart, and little kids were running around with the signposts that had been put up.
I thought it was a toy.
So people couldn't find their way anymore. So that was a little bit that was a challenge.
Yeah.
So there are new challenges every time. So the Toronto challenge was a very serious one, of course.
The hybrid format.
Then when we should have gone to winter tour in 21, the pandemic had COVID pandemic had hit us, and then of course we had to go. Well, actually, only 2 months before the conference, we decided to go fully online. Because it was clear by that time that because of so many cancellations for in-person participation, that we would get a very bizarre event with sessions with maybe 1 or 2 people and everybody else following online. But still, if you have these kinds of sessions, you need space. And that's very bizarre. So
still a challenge.
And then because of the developing technology, which of course is extremely interesting because it is a very emancipatory kind of thing. It allows people to attend who don't have the means to go to the place of the event. So we decided to have a fully hybrid event, and last year in Brussels. Which of course again has its own challenges, and I must say we underestimated the effect this would have on the in-person participants, because they have to fully adapt to an event that is also online, and this takes learning. So it does not go without its hurdles.
Of course.
So there are hurdles there. The next one in Brisbane, so of course there will be an online platform that can be used for a number of purposes, but the idea is to have actually, a focus on in-person participation for the very simple reason that the time differences are incredible. So if you have a full day program in Brisbane, you have a full night program
in Europe.
That simply doesn't work.
No, of course
simply doesn't work.
Yeah, but as you said, challenges are also opportunities, right?
Of course.
Heightened accessibility for people who wouldn't have made it to.
And there is plenty of interest to take on the challenges. So without all those people in those different places who have done all the footwork, it wouldn't have worked. And enthusiasm remains. So I don't doubt that we will have very good proposals again for the next time.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
Stepping back to the field of pragmatics, the discipline of pragmatics, where do you as an observer, after that I would like to come back to you as a pragmatic scholar, but now as an observer of the discipline, where do you think it's heading?
That is the most difficult question you can ask.
I know.
Because there's no way of predicting, of course.
I know, but what do you think?
And, I don't even think I can say anything sensible about where I think it will be going, but I can only say something about what the kinds of problems are that need to be addressed.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And first of all, I want to refer for that to someone else's work, namely Steve Levinson, who was the president until last year. He gave a presidential address at the Brussels conference with as a title, "The Dark Matter of Pragmatics."
Yeah, I was there.
Right?
Yeah.
And basically what he does there, and now it's actually available as a booklet.
No, is it? Okay.
So you can, so Cambridge University Press put it out as a very little booklet, which can also be downloaded freely, actually, open access. And so what he does there is describe a number of things about which he knows that we don't know them yet. Yeah? And so I would definitely want to advise anybody who is interested in what needs to be done in the field of pragmatics to go and have a look there, because it's an excellent summary of a range of problems that still need to be addressed.
Yeah.
Now, if you ask me, one of the the main thing that there are. It's difficult to say the main thing because there are so many different things that need to be addressed. One of them is the balance between, on the one hand, aspects that can be supposed to be universal, and everything else that is variable, right? We cannot avoid the idea that, okay, since we basically genetically have a common competence for language, which is basically the same for everybody anywhere in the world, that this is a very important aspect of what is happening with language. But at the same time, you have all these different languages and different styles of communicating with language that you need to get a grasp on to understand what is really happening in language use, and how do you link this up to. So that's a huge challenge, which I personally don't know exactly how to tackle. So we can only hope that some of the new research tools that are being developed, which I don't have any good understanding of, that the new research tools will be helpful in getting closer to these kinds of issues. But what I can say something about is, well, okay, the most flattering thing that you can say, of course, about human beings is that they are meaning-making machines, right?
Well, machines, yeah.
So that's reference to this competence, right?
Yeah.
So they are meaning-making machines. But then the question is, what happens in the making of meaning? And basically, language use is nothing else than that. So the essence of language use is interactively making meanings. And negotiating about meanings. And in order to do that, there are a bunch of capacities that you have to make use of. You need the capacity to categorize things, because the world is this blur of phenomena, which of course is not totally unarticulated, because there is some structure in those phenomena, which is why it was possible to talk about prototypes, for instance. So there is a prototypical bird, which lays eggs and flies. So reality is not unstructured if you look at the nuts and bolts. But still, most of what you encounter is this big blur of phenomena, which you have to categorize, in which you have to select elements that you label as categories. And that is what you do with languages when you use words,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And all languages are different. This blur of phenomena is labeled differently, categorized somewhat differently, though there are also probably some universal tendencies in there as well, which is why Berlin and case studies on car terms were so interesting, for instance, and which is why I had the hubris to, at a certain time, dare to talk about universals in terms for language use. Yeah. Now, in addition to this categorization capacity, you also have to be able to link elements, categorized elements, and you do this in terms of conceptualizing them as states of affairs and events and so on, and that is what in languages your whole grammar is all about, to do something at that level. But then, in order to use language in an interactive context, well, there is this other capacity that you need, namely you have to be able to hypothesize about what is happening in someone else's mind. Yeah. So without that, you wouldn't even know where to start speaking.
Speaking, yeah, exactly.
Now, so if you then see what languages do in order to enable us to interactively make meaning, that is, well, okay, you can start looking at languages as somehow conglomerates of sedimented realization patterns of meaning potential.
Okay.
Because everything else is just, it's potential.
Yeah, it's potential.
So and for me in this whole talking about using language as meaning making, I've become more and more convinced that it is important to put central to all that the notion of meaning potential.
Yeah.
So and what languages do is they form structures of realization patterns of that potential, right? And these patterns are sedimentations at a certain level because they have a relative degree of stability, but they are not unchangeable, right? So they can be
negotiated,
but the forms that are there are themselves also subject to change.
Yeah.
And then the next thing is, of course, once you have these sedimented realization patterns of meaning potential, then what do you actually do with those patterns in actual language use? Because then there you get to a whole different level of potentiality again. To give you just one simple example, all languages have patterns of negation. These patterns themselves vary across languages. But even if you have equivalent patterns, at a certain level, the way in which they are used can still differ quite significantly. And to give you a very simple example, well, there is this, well, it's an example I always use, so easy to remember.
Yeah.
So an article in an issue of The Economist, which says it's easy to despair of the British economy. The same issue of The Economist was translated into French.
Yeah.
What does the French version say? French version says, il faut bien du courage pour ne pas désespérer de l'économie britannique. Now, so what you get there is a perspective reversal. Get a perspective reversal. And then the question is, why? Is this purely a stylistic matter? Or is there something in the structure of French that pushes in the direction of that perspective reversal or not? Even if it is only a stylistic issue, even then you can ask the question, is the meaning that gets communicated really the same,
Yeah.
because the issue of despair, by being embedded lower in the structure, may become less active in the interpretation of a text and so on. So how do these things work? Okay, that for me, that is one of the most challenging issues for which we haven't found any real answers.
Okay.
And which I think need to be worked on in order to, well, to really advance in our understanding of what it is that is happening in language use.
That's for the pragmatics of the future.
Yes, and to the extent that we can still try to contribute to that a little bit.
Sure.
But most probably for some aspects of that set of problems, new research techniques will have to be developed that that we cannot even imagine too clearly now.
No, true.
Yeah.
For my last question, I would like to come back to you as a pragmatics scholar. So we already talked about your metapragmatic work in the context of your PhD, so in the first years. But from that point forward, can you walk us through your academic biography? Certainly there were things simultaneously, etc. But the main strands and tracks of research that you've done and the main landmarks in that for you.
Yeah, there are actually mainly two paths that I've been following, which are not uninterrelated. But one is more on the theoretical side, and that is, well, and the best reflection of that is still probably my book Understanding Pragmatics, which was not meant as a strict theory of pragmatics. It was meant as a framework allowing us to talk about different things that happen that are being done from different perspectives in relation to the study of language use. So it's a very general sketch of a framework that can serve as a point of reference for locating specific types of pragmatic research.
Okay.
It was intended by people who originally invited me to write the book as a textbook. Now, what I just said already implies that as a textbook it couldn't work very well.
And in hindsight, you don't consider it to be. And in hindsight, you don't consider it to be just a textbook.
No, I don't consider it to be a textbook. No, it contains some elements that that you could label textbook-like, but that's only the very first chapters. And so if you want to go to a real textbook, it's still much better to go back to Levinson. So because to get a good introduction to the nuts and bolts of what is
technicalities.
So that's still unrivaled, I think, from that point of view. Now, even though the scope is not as wide as I would like it to be, but if the scope would be as wide as I would like it to be, probably he could not have written a textbook either. Now, so so very soon it was also not used as a textbook anymore. So there was a little time, I think, that some people were trying to use it, but that doesn't work very well. And especially from the moment that some people were trying to interpret some of the notions as operational notions, like for instance the notion of adaptability. So okay, so just to repeat this very quickly, okay, there are three basic notions for me for an understanding of language use, and the first one is variability. If we don't take into account variability, we are lost. Then we also have to take into account negotiability. So if you don't if you think that there are fixed form-function relationships, you're lost as well.
Absolutely.
And then how can you understand that with this variable tool, which can be used in such a negotiable manner, you can still effectively communicate, or for most practical purposes anyway, well, then you must assume that there is an enormous amount of adaptability involved. And then some people have been trying to use adaptability as an operational notion in much the same way as relevance in relevance theory, but that doesn't work, of course. So you don't get anywhere with that. So, but as a frame of reference, I still keep thinking in terms that I was describing in understanding pragmatics, which is, for instance, clear in the way in which I was trying to develop some methodological steps to keep in mind for the study of ideology in language use. Now, so it is usable from that point of view, but that's it. But that's the main thing that I've done in terms of
theory formation.
Theory formation, I think. Then there are, of course, little bits like the article on metapragmatic awareness, for instance, which has been picked up significantly in the literature on metapragmatics. But next to that, there is mostly the much more empirical work, focusing completely on discourse. And the main contribution in that area probably dates back to the 1990s, which is a period that you, well, remember very well as well from the University of Antwerp. When, so in collaboration with Jan Blommaert, so we did these studies of discourse on migration, and I think we did make a significant contribution there. By when we were pointing out that that actually deep down the attitudes towards diversity in society were not much better on the side of the so-called tolerant majority than in the side of the extreme right. And in those days, we were, on the basis of that, giving the explicit warning that political parties in the mainstream should avoid moving towards the right, but which they unfortunately have all done that in the meantime.
Which we witnessed yesterday.
Which we witnessed yesterday during the elections, yes.
In Belgium,
and so I think that was an important contribution in the sense that, well, actually, first of all, we didn't find a publisher, so we had to publish it ourselves.
Which was indicative, of the...
So, but then again, clearly there was something in the air because it caught on. So we first printed 500 copies. We needed to print another 500 and then another 500. So for something that you put out yourself in a Flemish context, that is quite a significant number of copies that get distributed.
Absolutely,
and also the main achievement there was probably that it gave minorities a vocabulary to a certain extent, or at least helped them in finding their vocabulary to talk about their own situation and to start and to be activists in the pursuit of their own rights and their own position. So
notions such as an ideology of homogeneity, things like that.
That's right. Yes. So, and they have been using that actively and relatively successfully, I think. Not successfully enough because the mainstream drifted towards the right. Now, after a while, so in the 1990s, then together with Jan, I was also relatively active in showing up for all kinds of meetings and discussions and things like that. But towards the end of that decade, I began to notice that I was always talking to the same people who were already convinced of what I was saying anyway. And that is not so extremely useful in the long run. Then there was also something that was intervening, namely in the early 2000s. Then, by no conscious choice of my own, I drifted into the position of dean of my faculty, which was an 8-year-long position, a period during which, from spending 80% of my time on research, I was spending 80% of my time on administration. But fortunately, I had a very good continuing group of PhD students in those days, which kept me hanging on there. And the main contribution that I thought I should make in that period, after having become less activist, was to try and develop some methodological guidelines, pragmatics-based methodological guidelines for doing ideological analyses of discourse. Because the main wall that you bump into when you go out into the world with what you think you have found as a researcher, the main wall that you bump into is the judgment that, oh well, that's just another opinion. So you really have to be able to show that that what you are coming up with
is science,
is methodologically grounded.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's the whole basis for this book on language, on ideology and language use,
scientific credibility.
Which I'm happy to say there is one book that is going to appear not too long from now, I hope, which completely follows the those guidelines in analyzing one specific corpus. But okay, I'm not going to mention any names now because you never know what happens with book publications.
Okay.
Maybe it won't appear, and then
maybe they want to change the title, right? Or maybe
well, we'll see what happens.
Okay.
Now,
when can we expect that?
Well, I think if everything goes well, sometime next year, I think. Yes.
Greatly looking forward to that.
Now, okay, then, well, I have kept, I have remained active in that direction of studying discourse from the point of view of ideology. The most recent thing is this analysis, which I think, well, I sent it to you as well, an analysis of the Canon van Vlaanderen, which is this book that was actually ordered by the Flemish government to capture everything that is essential knowledge about Flanders for people who live in Flanders, and which was criticized very heavily by historians before it appeared because of the obvious risks of politically guided historiography. And so now it's a year since it has appeared, and so I've taken a lot of time to just having a look at the text as text and what its meaning potential is.
And its meaning making,
Yes. And so I could only come to the conclusion, basically, that the criticism that was launched in advance was absolutely legitimate, because the whole book now is basically a flag for Flemish nationalism. So that's what it is. So I could give more details of that, of course, but that is not necessarily
you
interesting in this case. Now, but I also hope that with that specific piece of work, I've gotten some reactions already from historians who say that they are extremely happy that a non-historian did the analysis, because they have now been pushed in a position where if they still voice criticism, they are either labeled as people who are jealous of the others who were involved in the project, or else they are ivory tower scientists, just totally detached from society. So I hope, I've small hopes.
That's good.
that this may, in the longer run, also score a little bit of an effect, not too dissimilar from what was done with the critical studies of discourse on migration. But we'll see what happens. But I think the next thing I want to do is dive back into the whole problem of meaning making.
Theory formation again.
Something like that. Yes.
Lovely. Yeah. I'm sure we're all looking forward to that very much.
Well,
I've asked the questions I wanted to ask. Is there something you would like to add that maybe I've overlooked?
No. Also, I am slowly getting out of breath, of course. And the only thing is, I hope that I have not forgotten to mention some people who have been extremely instrumental in all of this. So, like the whole range of PhD students whom you were one of a long time ago. Well, they've all had their very special place in this whole development, because actually, well, you've experienced it yourself. So I have always very consciously provided very minimal guidance for PhD students.
Freedom, we call it.
Right. Because I, well, it's in the same frame of mind as the setting up of the International Pragmatics Association, where what you want is something that is open, that provides a forum for discussion where ideas can mature and interact. So in the same way, my philosophy for PhD students was, well, okay, if they have the courage to start on a PhD trajectory, they should be given the freedom to really find and pursue their own ideas. So there are even instances of PhDs that were delivered with a single reference, without a single reference to my work.
You're proud of that?
Yes, I'm proud of that.
That's good. Yeah, well, that says a lot about your modesty and the way we know you. That's very characteristic.
Which does not mean, of course, that I don't want to be quoted.
No, I know, but still, no. I think this is a beautiful. A beautiful sentence to end this lovely, very fascinating chat we've had. Thank you very much for this. Thank you for being there.
Thank you for the opportunity to reflect.
My pleasure. It was absolutely my pleasure. And I think I can say this on behalf of the entire pragmatics community. Thank you for everything you have done, for everything you still are and you still do for the field of pragmatics. Thank you very much.
Thank you.